going on that journey from these top-down constraints, these filters, into that, open wandering, that's where the spiritual and the scientific and the clinical, the healing process all come together in this really, I think, liberating way.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Professor Dan Siegel. On the 14th of January 2025, I'll be in conversation with Dan at LA's flagship Barnes & Noble at the Grove at Farmers Market to promote my new book, The Dawn of Mind. Tickets are still available, so come along if you're nearby. Dan Siegel is a renowned psychiatrist and internationally acclaimed author. He's the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, an educational center devoted to promoting insight, compassion, and empathy in individuals, families, institutions, and communities. He's also the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA and is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine. Dan is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers and over 15 other books which have been translated into over 40 languages. Today, we speak about science, spirituality, and his most recent book, Intraconnected. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Professor Dan Siegel. Dan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, James. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I'd like to begin with, I heard in an interview you mentioned that you, was David Hubel a teacher of yours when you worked with him or he taught you at some point?
Yeah. So when I was in medical school, he was my neuroscience professor. So that was in 1978. Yeah. And then
for the audience, maybe you could share who he was, because to me, studying neuroscience, anyone who studies perception, he's a huge name, huge deal. Yeah.
Yeah, well, David he had a lab where he was doing his studies. And for those who are squeamish about vivisection and everything like that, I mean, he was studying kittens. And, these were cats that would have been, killed in a shelter. So their lives were not going to be fulfilled in a home. But he did studies to try to show that the kinds of visual experiences they had directly shaped the structure of what we call the visual cortex, which is probably more a spatial cortex. So if they were raised with just vertical lines, and no horizontal lines, they just couldn't detect horizontal lines after a certain window of opportunity for those columns in the visual cortex to grow. So that was the setup, when I was a student, and he taught us basic, neuroscience. And what was striking was in 1981, I had stopped school because I was very disillusioned with the kind of medical socialization that was going on. But that year, 1981, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for showing that, experience shapes the brain. But at the same year, and the same prize was shared by Roger Sperry across the country in Caltech in Pasadena, where he showed that there were innate differences in the left and right hemisphere of the brain. So in a way, that prize that year ended up being what really inspired me, because I always was wondering, what are the innate features of the nervous system, things like temperament? And then how do experiences shape the structure of that nervous system also in neuroplasticity terms, and so I became an attachment researcher and was always weighing those two things. How do the innate qualities of the nervous system and the learned structural influences on the nervous system affect who we are?
Right. And yeah, this that kind of synthesizing instinct, that instinct to balance extremes, is something that comes through very strongly in your work, that the kind of wisdom of the middle way, you could say. And I mean, that could be a good way into talking about science and spirituality. And I think, so in your book, Intraconnected, you kind of go through all the way from basically physics and how we think about the unfolding of the universe, all the way through to human development and the sense of self. And I wonder if you could give a sketch of how you see science and spirituality fitting together from that most kind of fundamental level onwards.
Well, James, it's really a fascinating question, because in my own childhood growing up, there was no discussion whatsoever of spirituality. My mother was deeply and still is deeply into history. My father, when he was alive, he was a mechanical engineer and was very interested in Newtonian physics. You know, how you build things, build brake systems to stop a car, in motion and things like that. So the word spirituality never was spoken in our house. There was no participation in religion. There was no discussion of even our relationship with nature or even of each other. So it was a very kind of factual based uh, social environment I grew up in. So when I ultimately got to become interested in the mind and helping people with their mental health, what became really clear was that relationships were fundamental to how the mind emerges. And that started just a whole journey to say, could Hippocrates have been saying part of a larger story when they said the mind was just the brain? So that's been said for like 2,500 years. So when I became an attachment researcher studying relationships, it felt like the mind was living within the relational atmosphere or field of the connections of a child to the parent, for example. So for me, the mind was always kind of located within the relational world and within the nervous system and the whole embodied experience we have. So it was natural to kind of think in those two ways. So as I started writing about it, people said, "Oh, this is spiritual writing." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they even used this graduate school textbook I wrote called The Developing Mind as a spiritual textbook. And I was totally befuddled. I mean, I'm really confused. And then I started getting asked to speak at spirituality and science conferences. And one of the first ones was in Freiburg for I think it was the 550th birthday of the University of Freiburg or some huge number like that. And the Dalai Lama was the main speaker, and I was a workshop facilitator. And so when I got to the workshop, I said, "I think this is a mistake. I don't know anything about spirituality. Please teach me." So everyone went around the room. There were about 75 people, and they said the same essential thing, that spirituality was about a life of meaning beyond just surviving and connection beyond the boundaries of your skin. So I looked at the group when they were all done going around, and I said, "Are you telling me spirituality is about meaning and connection?" They go, "Yeah." I go, "Oh, okay." Now I get it. So the journey since then, and that was probably 2007. So it was a while ago. I think for me, it's been a journey. Initially, before that meeting with His Holiness, it was I was teaching a lot with John O'Donohue, who is an Irish Catholic priest, a former priest, and an Irish mystic, and a philosopher and a poet. And so John and I met, and we started really teaching a lot together, and he became a very close friend. And before he passed, our mission was to try to find this weaving of science and spirituality. And I got to say, one of the most vulnerable moments I had was 10 years after he passed. We did a memorial for John's life in Ireland, near where he was raised. And so I was doing this whole thing on science and spirituality in honor of John. And then I gave this kind of interpretation of some of the studies on consciousness and quantum physics, and trying to tie them into a view of, where awareness may come from. And I'm an acronym kind of addict. So I had an acronym for this quantum vacuum being called the generator of diversity. So I said, well, if that's an acronym, it's the GOD. And I looked up beyond, John's family and my family that were there. In the next row were all of John's Catholic priest classmates. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have now committed this terrible violation. So I went up to them afterwards, and they were so happy. They said, "That's beautiful, Dan. That's great. That's great." And so it's been an interesting thing since then, many years now. I found that religious leaders and spiritual teachers sort of gather around that. And I don't know if is that Ram Dass back there in your picture?
It is, yeah. That's my array of spiritual inspiration.
So right before Ram Dass died, I happened to be able to be with him and have some dinner with him. And we went out on Mondays. Sometimes he, even though he had had a stroke, he would go out in the water. And so everyone brought him out in the water, throwing petals around him. And he and I were chatting. So I was telling him about this plane of possibility, this God, as being, the correlate of, a neural origin and a existential origin of our experience of being aware. And he started just, hitting the water, slapping the water, and just saying, "That's it, that's it, that's it." And it was this beautiful moment in my own journey, because when I was 14 and I read Be Here Now, it really influenced me a lot. I had to keep it as the secret book in my house, because no one would want me to be reading it. But so it was a beautiful thing. So it's great to see his picture back there with you.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates because I'd say if there's a thing that's at the core of my interest of science and spirituality, it's to communicate that the spiritual insight is pointing to genuine insight about the way the world is, about our circumstance being one of connection, interdependence. And so it makes sense that as a scientist, trying to just study how we exist as these interconnected relational beings, that you would stumble into truths that people put under the umbrella term of spiritual, but you're just like, well, these are just truths. This is just how it is, right? So it makes sense that will lead you there.
Well, how did that come up for you? These worlds of science and worlds of spirituality, which John would always say there never should have been a divorce between the two worlds, but it happened. But what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, so my background, my grandfather was Irish, and so I grew up in a Catholic household. And when I was a teenager, it took it. It seems that other people were less bothered by it than I was, but I took it very seriously. The threat of hell and the inability to have blind faith was the thing that really bothered me, because I guess I was already quite rationally minded, and I wanted to have blind faith because of the intimidation threat of hell, but I couldn't. And so I one day I was on a bus ride, and I got into a kind of thought loop of trying to will myself to have blind faith, finding I couldn't, thinking, well, how could a supposedly benevolent God, create me without blind faith? But he's going to torture me forever for not having it. But I can't have it. But he made me this way, and kind of going around and around this loop. And I think it functioned like a Zen koan, basically, because I just hit a dead end, and I stopped thinking, and I had a very profound, spontaneous mystical experience or an awakening, or suddenly the thought paradigm evaporated, and I was just incredibly profoundly present with a sense of no separation, just the one reality expressing. Basically, it was very it was life changing, and yeah, as someone who had a distaste for dogma, for supernaturalism and stuff from my Catholic childhood, the thing about it was that it felt very much like, oh, I'm seeing clearly for the first time in my life. Like, I've woken up to what's really going on. I'm not really this separate James who needs to be identified with thought. And so I think if I hadn't had that experience, I may have just never approached spirituality, because I would have been alienated by the feeling there has to be something supernatural, it has to be something, maybe it's a delusion, maybe it's something, but that felt like a clear seeing. So that's what set me off on, and then training in neuroscience. And then I feel like I've, come to very similar perspectives to before I read your work. It was very validating reading it, because I say, here's someone who's seeing the same kinds of things in terms of, you mentioned the God, the plane of possibility is another way you describe it, the kind of energy flow of reality being kind of potential, becoming actual. I think all of that is spot on. And it feels like there's a pointing towards truths rather than playing with ideas that are made up, which is again how I would have thought of spirituality before connecting with it.
Yeah. So James, how old were you when that evaporation of the thought loop happened?
I think I was only 13. I was 13 or 14. Wow. It's very young, yeah. And so it was that normal age where people start to. I mean, I would have had to have my confirmation. Yeah, I was 13 because it was before my confirmation, which would have been when I was 13. I'm pretty sure I wasn't 12. But yeah, I mean, and that's also, like to point out that when people have these, they feel extraordinary, these experiences, but they're the opposite of something you like gain or something you acquire through a certain exceptional trait or something. Like, as a 13-year-old who was very neurotically stuck in rumination, it was a collapsing into being. It was a letting go of the thought thing, and the stuff we're pointing to, the interconnection, the beingness, is all just here, like effortlessly and obviously the case. So it's yeah, you don't have to, and I guess it's available to everyone. Is my point. You don't have to be someone special, or you can be a
Yeah,
neurotic 13-year-old.
exactly. Well, exactly. And what's so beautiful about hearing your story is there is a deep lesson in it about um and there's a kind of simplicity in the concepts that I think you're trying to address and I'm trying to address that seem so difficult to grasp. But the wisdom, and it's so interesting to see the figures behind you and then the brain is there, is that it's almost like, and I'm going to say this too simply, but it might just be this simple. I don't know. It's almost like we're born into a body that has these Newtonian, what are called macro state qualities of living in a realm that physics has demonstrated, has this appearance of spatial and temporal separation.
Mhm.
Things have the appearance of being noun-like entities, fixed objects, like your body, James, is there, Dan, my body is here. We can be on this digital a way to relate to each other, but we're separate. Um, and that's in such contrast to something that you can gain access to if you give up the illusion of certainty that's
Right.
embedded in that noun-like realm, right? But when you give that up, and in quantum physics terms, it would be called the quantum realm, which would be the microstates that researchers with very rigorous empirical research can look at small states like electrons or photons. And there are no noun-like entities. They're only verb-like processes that are massively connected across even separations of Newtonianly defined time and space. So when you as a 13-year-old or before you're 13, when you drop in, and maybe for me, it was a few times when I was around the same age, just going out in nature and almost feeling like my body dropped away and I was
Mhm.
like a part of the whole, in one case, forest, in another case, the stars, and just going, whoa, and then coming back into the body, no substances, just the substance of the breath, breathing. Or a time when I was almost 20 that I think I talk about in the Intraconnected book, where I had this horse accident. It knocked my head so much, about 100 meters, when the saddle fell to the horses, went to the horse's belly, and I was dragged. Um, and afterwards, I think my understanding of losing an identity and entering that almost hilarious state where it's all one unfolding, magnificent process. And even though I had all these broken bones and people would look at me like I should be in pain, and there must have been pain, it was just all so funny. I mean, it was so funny. And then finally, after a day, when the identity of Dan came back, it had this lightness quality to it. Like, I know people are calling this body Dan, but it's much bigger than that. And I'll go with that since I have a body, but it's so much bigger than that. So I think that experience when I was 20, uh, made it so it was hard to go back to the illusion of certainty. And if you can embrace the uncertainty of that quantum realm, all sorts of magnificent stuff starts to arise. Connections. Like, I feel like when you reached out to me, I felt like, wow, okay, we can resonate with each other. And you almost tap into this, I want to call it magic, but that's not really the word, because it's not really, uh, I mean, it's almost deeper. It's almost like you're tapping into a connectivity that the Newtonian clinging on to, um, an illusion of fantasy. This, as the artist Rashid says on the entrance to the Brooklyn in New York, Brooklyn Public Library, she says, having discovered the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. Well, her decision to wander takes a lot of courage, because you have this flimsy fantasy, you have the desire for certainty that'll somehow make you think you're going to be happy or fulfilled or figure it out or content. And when you drop out of that, that's when the fun starts happening, because then you say, I'm not in control. And I can wander, but as I forgot who the author who said, all who wander are not lost. And
Right.
there's some famous author who said that. I can't think of the person's name. But anyway, so when you reached out, I felt like, you know, there are a lot of neuroscientists, I got to say, who hear what I teach or read the Intraconnected or whatever, and they roll their eyes and they say, you should not leave the brain. Why are you leaving the brain to understand consciousness? I say, because I had this collection of data of 50,000 people who did this wheel of awareness practice. And I would say, I'm just looking for a correlate for what people say the experience of pure awareness really is and other aspects of consciousness. I said, so I find it in physics, but I actually don't find it in neuroscience at this moment anyway. So I'm just, as a scientist, trying to find, is there an empirical way to understand why, when people get into this hub of a wheel, if the metaphor is a wheel where what you're aware of is on the rim, the awareness itself is represented in the hub. When they get to the hub, and this can be someone who's never meditated before. You don't have to be doing this for 25 years and then suddenly you get this realization. They can get it in 25 minutes. And what happens is they say it becomes timeless. They're connected to everyone and everything. These are phrases that are often said: love, joy, this sense of ease, and this sense that there's no noun-like entities anymore and that everything is connected, And so they talk about love and these things that are so much a part of the writings and spiritual teachings that, for me, not being a spiritual person, when I had this 50,000 person survey going on and all these, quote, spiritual type things are being said, when, one neuroscientist actually came to a meeting where, people did the wheel, they started sharing this. His comment was, "You've hypnotized everyone." I said, "What?" Because I'm a therapist, so I know how to hypnotize people. I said, "How did I hypnotize them?" "You hypnotized them to have a spiritual experience." And everyone, these were a bunch of scientists doing this. Everyone was listening to him and looked at him like, "What?" I mean, how unopen can you be? But he was one of the many neuroscientists who chased me down the hallways and say, "Stop talking about quantum physics and the mind," So,
I mean, I think, yeah, so in the book, I like the language you use around energy flows, because you use that language to say that kind of existence is energy flow. And then that's a way, and you can think about consciousness too being a kind of energy flow, and particularly one that's embodied and relational. I think that's totally spot on in that when you position it there as something more fundamental than a kind of complex computation running on a brain, you can, it feels to me like you can, speaking of science, synthesizing science and spirituality, from there, from saying it is this embodied relational energy flow, you can look towards the specifics of the individual and say, okay, well, here's why there are neural correlates, and here's why it's to do with the body, and here's how it relates. Or you can look the other direction towards a more fundamental ground and say, and here's why in spiritual experience, it's very adjacent to, or even part of, that pure open potential formless ground that we are talking about, it takes you more into that kind of subatomic physics stuff. And so I think by positioning it as energy flow rather than something running on a genuinely separate brain as a kind of complex computation, I think that's the sweet spot that makes sense of both accounts. So you don't have to collapse into, well, I'm just a scientist who just has to be the brain, or I'm just on the spiritual side and it has to, everything's consciousness. You can bring the two together, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's when you take a deep breath and acknowledge that as a scientist, you're supposed to really question things and doubt things. And in a deep way, from a scientific perspective, you are to challenge even your ways of thinking about things. So if you think about Michael Faraday, for example, in Britain, coming up with the idea of electromagnetic fields. And people thought he was nuts. Fields, if you can't see them with the eye, they don't exist, right? Well, all of our electronics are based on these fields. They're the way it all works, even though you can't see them with the eye. So when I hear you, James, speaking about how it feels natural to think about energy terms, and even think about how our experience with each other can directly influence fundamental aspects of our mental lives, like awareness, then it's, I think, a truly scientific stance to say, yes, to only put something as profound as the mind only inside of a skull, even though I know that's the only thing that fits inside of a scanner, we can acknowledge that. So if you really are devoted to your scanner view of the world, sure, it's going to be something you look at only in the brain. So what I try to always reassure my neuroscientist friends is that this is not to push away from the brain. It's to expand the conversation. And even, I got to say, one of my colleagues, Amishi Jha, when she heard me give a talk on, you know, the plane of possibility as a possible origin of pure awareness, she looked for it using a computerized electroencephalogram technique to say, well, maybe there's a correlate in the brain. And they found it because she had the model that was inspired by people saying, what was the experience? That's the wheel of awareness stuff. So she probably wouldn't have looked at it for it in this way, but they were looking for a brain state that was, from a computerized EEG point of view, states of the least focused, committed states. And there was a way to analyze that. Her wonderful computer scientist did that. So what is exciting about that is consilient with, meaning it comes from an independent way of reasoning, from the wheel of awareness. Then Amishi Jha can find the correlate using just pure awareness correlates of computerized EEG. But if you look at some of the stuff on psychedelics, it talks about, there are the entropic brain hypothesis, where the brain achieves these very non-committed states of entropic, if you will, randomness. And then what happens there, let's say as a therapist, is I can take models of, and Wolf Singer talks a lot about this, top-down processing, where in our cortical means, we have all these restricted filters, if you will, from prior learning, like an expectation from what you're taught from your family, or I was taught from my family, that in the cortex, based on like what we started with David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, you've learned then these things that have shaped how your cortex is going to basically take energy and make sense of it, if you will. And so if you're taught in one view versus another view, and you and I may have had totally opposite upbringings that way, you then are, whichever it is, you're in this very restricted top-down set of cortical columns, just to stay in the brain, that are going to filter energy through their own, if you will, narrative. But then when you can have a moment where, almost like a Zen koan, you had this experience when you're 12 of it all dissolving, you could say you were able to somehow allow your cortex to open up from its restricted top-down filtering, or in my case, just being in nature when I was around the same age, or when I was almost 20, having the horse accident, which probably just knocked those cortical columns out. And then I'm just like, okay, the narrative identity we have with all the things we were taught with top-down filters drops away from a koan or from nature or from a headbanging, or in the case of research now, these psychedelics, and if you can integrate that letting go of the flimsy fantasy of certainty that the cortical columns have been taught is the only way to live, is to have certainty. And you can integrate it, meaning, can you come to live with it? Or in your case, have a journey to study it. In my case, study it. And I work with clients all the time as a therapist about it, or, attend retreats or teach retreats. If people then can get to be comfortable with that uncertainty and here it comes to the simple statement from before, you can show, I think, that there's a freedom that helps dissolve away mild to moderate depression. There's a freedom that even when people are facing a terminal illness and death, they can find peace in dying. There's a way when people are riddled with anxiety, or paralyzed by post-traumatic states, that going on that journey from these top-down constraints, these filters, into that, open wandering, that's where the spiritual and the scientific and the clinical, the healing process, all come together in this really, I think, liberating way that you can also get into the politics of the planet and people's relationship to nature, which I try to do in Intraconnected, because ultimately you could say the lie of the separate self is a Newtonian lie that modern culture is shoving onto people. And then what they do is they think reality is just about this little body they're in. And if you build a factory, you don't really care if you pollute the world. And because at least you got more money and you can buy more stuff. That's basically that's kind of the world we've grown into. And indigenous teachings have taught us otherwise. Contemplative teachings have taught us otherwise. So these are long time invitations from those two traditions, indigenous cultures and contemplative practices. Science, we can now just try to join as a latecomer to the important invitation to be very careful of the human mind's vulnerability to have the solo self view, which, in some ways, saying the mind is just coming from the brain unintentionally reinforces that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's born out of it. I think you've got a lot of people, like where you coined this term solo self, the idea that it's genuinely solo, it's genuinely discrete, separate from the rest of the world, autonomous. And that, because I think when you've got people walking around with that assumption that is what they are, that either is the body or inhabits the body, that's going to shape, filter the way that they think about the world. And it seems like common sense. Well, I feel like I'm in here, probably behind my eyes in my brain looking out. So consciousness has got to be something to do with me in here. And seeing through that, having pure awareness experiences, I think is a corrective to come away from that extreme. And in Intraconnected, you talk a lot about, you really emphasize this wisdom of the thing isn't to say, well, okay, self bad, let's go completely the opposite direction and go to the other extreme. But you talk a lot about exploring this kind of balance of me plus we, right? You describe it as we, this term that you coined.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak to that especially on that top down view, it feels very aligned in terms of, the top down view of the self, the part that feels separate from the world versus the bottom up in connection with the sensory experiences. It feels like there's lots of correspondences here with the relational and the embodied thing as well. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, absolutely. Well, thank you, James. It's so wonderful to be here with you because, these invitations aren't really grasped by a lot of people because sometimes they'll say, well, you're saying that the self is more than the individual. And I go, yeah. And they go, that's just wrong. And they'll just stop. It stops right. It's over. And even before I wrote the book, some people were saying, you're taking on a word that is so synonymous with the individual. You're going to waste your time. And I thought, okay, maybe I shouldn't do it. Maybe I shouldn't do it. But then when I thought about what the studies of selfhood and self-experience kind of look at three things. They look at the sensation of something, the perspective of that something, and the agency to act on behalf of something. So if you make that an acronym, it's SPA, right? So there's the feeling of what it's like to be whatever that entity is, if we're going to use the word entity for a self, that process that is a center of experience. So S is subjective experience, P is the point of view or perspective, and A is the agency. So then you can just simply say, look, the SPA of self-experience is not limited to the individual. It's just a very natural, logical, scientific thing to then say the linguistic term self should not be made a synonym for the individual. And then once I started, seeing that from the studies of self-experience, then I started feeling like maybe even though it's going to be a hard, fight, maybe it's a it's a question to raise that's worth all the pushback. So just like when I years ago tried to push back on mind being a synonym for brain activity, and I said, well, brain activity is a part of it, it's much bigger, and people go, no, it's inside your skull. So this is now, the self is not just inside your skin. So I know it'll take some time, but I love talking about this, James, because if we can appeal to the modern mind to consider that the linguistic term self, when it's used as a synonym for the individual, so the solo self, even if it's plural individual, like people like me, um, it's getting us into deep trouble for the individual. There's a lot of despair and loneliness, and people are on these existential treadmills where they believe from a top-down cortical point of view, oh, I'm just this body and that's all it's about. Well, why wouldn't you freak out? Because the body's not going to last forever. And then why are you here in the first place? And I may as well get stuff. It's a natural outcome to be in this cycle of production and consumption, production and consumption. If you have basically what's called a violation of epistemic trust. Epistemic is how we come to know what we know. So if the world is giving you what's called a master narrative, like you are just your body, then you're going to be desperately trying to figure out, okay, now what do I do? And you come up with all these really destructive things for your own individual life or other people's lives. So you could go all the way to the other extreme. And I tried on a fun term from me to we, and one of my students came to me and she said, you are a hypocrite. I said, how am I a hypocrite? And she said, well, you said it's important to know where your body has been in terms of attachment, making sure you understand where you've been. Yes, I said that. You said it's important to know your ancestry, like where you are in a long line across generations. I said, yeah, well, that's how I am as an individual, she said. I said, yeah, you're right. She goes, well, look at the name of your talk. And we looked at it, me to we. She goes, well, it may rhyme, me to we, but it's a lie. You don't want to go and give up me to get to we. So I said, oh my God, you're absolutely right. She goes, well, you've always taught about integration where you differentiate and you link. I go, okay. She goes, in the linkage, you don't lose the differentiation. She was quoting me. I said, you're right. She goes, so what would you say? I said, well, it's not only me, it's also additionally a we. She goes, that's too clunky. So I said, okay, well, if you have me and we, then I guess if you're going to integrate them and hold on to the essence, it would be like, I don't know, we. And she goes, that's it. And so, that's the word in English. I've been trying to get other languages to come up with it, but nothing is as simple as we. And what's fun about we, most people understand even the English word me and the English word we. It's grammatically incorrect because my copy editor always says it's either me and us or it's I and we. And I said, I'm not going to say if it's me and I'm not going to say must. That's not fun to say. Must doesn't get it. But M-E and W-E both share the E. So if you do we, you're getting the, she said it's wrong. I said, I don't care if it's wrong. So anyway, so we is the grammatically incorrect condensation of me and we. But the thing that's been so interesting about it, James, is, when you get to the we part of the wheel of awareness, I've had so many people come to me and say, that word, that simple 3-letter word, liberated me from having to choose between me or we. Because I don't want to let go of me, and me's not enough. I need to be a we, but how could I be both? So some people say, just say us. I said, but us doesn't have it because you can lose your individuality as an us or a we. Right. So that's why you need some kind of linguistic term. So whatever the term's going to be in whatever language, that's the origin of we. And what's been so interesting about it is, and this is probably the wonderful thing about top down, is if you can come up with a symbol like a word like mui, and people then have the downward impact of that is to feel in your body with the higher cortical statement mui, you start feeling in your body a kind of freedom. Like, oh, wow, it's individual and it's collective. It's me and it's we. It's I'm both. And then there's a freedom there. And when you start acting on behalf of us, we, then it has this interesting quality where you wouldn't say something like self-compassion. You would say inner compassion. And the compassion you direct to what we call, in quotes, another person, that other person is you. When you're compassionate toward the forest is your body. And so Mui allows you to walk through the world where when you see, like when I see you, you are me and I am you. And I'm not saying this in some trying to be poetic. I mean, literally, we are manifestations from the same plane of possibility. So we need to basically widen our identity lens so we can see the beauty that's in all of these aspects of reality that are who we are.
And that's a really nice thing in Intraconnected, where you take the reader on a journey of how is it that you could say we develops? How does it that the seemingly independent self, but also the interconnected self develops kind of in tandem? But it's written in a way where it's never lost that it's you could say the energy flow of the universe, the energy flow of existence going on this journey. You never present it as, oh, and at this point you're born and now you're a separate self who's alienated from the rest of existence. It's always clear that it's like, how does this energy develop into an embodied thing?
Well, I'm so glad you resonate with that journey, because when I was writing that out, I thought, people are going to think I'm just a weirdo, because we go from the Big Bang, where there was potentiality, and then we're going into now individual development, how a baby is, forming in utero and then comes out in the world, and then we go through all the life stages. So, when it was coming out like that, it was like, wow, this is a wild book, because it goes from the extremes of physics to literally what does it mean to be a kid who needs to, go to the bathroom or find someone to protect them, give them food. But it is that way. And I have incredible hope that because the human mind is so capable of change, that if we can bring to bear the deep wisdom of indigenous and contemplative practices and the teaching of meaning and connection that we can define as what spiritual means, with the power of science to be challenging things and never, convinced that you've settled on something that's absolutely true, but always be questioning. If we can question how modern culture has used the word self to mean the individual, I'm very hopeful, actually, that we can turn the troubles that we're in around. I really am. And maybe I'm, coming at it as a therapist who's seen so many people in dire straits with their mind change an entire, really painful way of living into, an incredible source of joy, that I feel like our human family can do the same. But I think if we stick with the lie of the separate self, it's not going to work out. It's just going to be Band-Aids that don't really hold anything together.
Well, I'm really glad you had the courage to write the book, even though there were parts of you that were aware there'd be skepticism and stuff could sound out far out. Because when I read it, I think you're spot on with the whole thing, and had come to similar conclusions. And when I was first writing them as well, I had a similar process where there were parts of me, internalized critics, internalized skeptics, that were like, "Are you sure? Like, it sounds a bit weird, like saying, going beyond the brain and beyond it." So it's very validating to see someone, who has had the same insights and just, kind of compare notes and be like, this is it's very validating.
That's great. What was it like for you when you were pushing the boundaries of your own training to start both seeing things yourself, but also saying things that were not just the accepted dogma?
Yeah, I think the seeing things took the form of being like, well, if you try on this way of looking, everything adds up, and this adds up, and this makes sense, and this makes so. When I kept seeing things harmonize, I was like, I can't I've now seen this harmony that's like I need to at least like this looks convincing to me. I need to try and state it as clearly as possible, and then even if I'm wrong, like at least that gives someone like if I can inhabit this perspective, then someone could modify it and improve on it if it's flawed in some way. So it felt like an act. It came from a place of service of like the parts of me that were afraid of criticism. I would acknowledge them, but they were kind of taking a back seat where it's like this isn't about even if everyone hates it and thinks that it's wrong. Like I think it's right, or at least I think it makes sense. So it's yeah. Then I think people are broadly polite with when it comes to disagreeing, I think people just tend to stop listening as opposed to saying anything particularly or maybe like dismiss as. But it's interesting when you said that people, not being open to this stuff. I really think that the nounification, the top-down, rigid kind of closing down of experience into feeling like sort of separate things, and then what we're talking about in terms of opening up to connection and ultimately to a radical openness of pure potentiality. I think when you outline a vision like this, it's very confronting to people who are in their separate self identify way of being because it's on a kind of emotional level behind all the words. There's this direct pointing or invitation to a possibility of openness, and I think on a gut level for a lot of people that's where the no comes from, where it's like nope, you've hypnotized all those people. I don't want to hear it, and so I think for on the note of hope for because I completely agree that this stuff is at the root of the sense of being a separate self is at the root of all of our pretty much all discord in the world when it comes down to it. And you mentioned a kind of hopefulness there, and I feel like it's for people who are struggling carrying wounds where they feel it's hard to come into connection. Maybe they haven't had that epistemic trust. To me, it feels like the missing piece is a kind of critical mass of support, of care, of like networks of care to like really create space to respect the me part of the we and allow it to go on its journey of healing to come into connection. I wonder if you could speak more to that note of hope, because the other thing when I think about the future is that you have a lot more experience of seeing people go through transformative change. But when I've seen it, I've tended to see a lot of people have to hit rock bottom before they really are willing to try something radically different. And that's my concern is that our global family might be on a runaway freight train that needs to have a sobering, that's going to hit a brick wall in order to sober up, and it's not going to kind of de-escalate it, itself. I would love it if it could. So yeah, I wonder what you would say to that.
Yeah. Well, to start, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. Just to start from like a systems view, in science, as people can be trained in what you can simply call linear thinking. Like when I was, a biochemistry major, I had to learn how molecule A interacted with molecule B. And if I could find, the enzyme that could allow them to convert into molecule C, I could publish a paper on it, or, figure out how this happened. And so that's a linear thinking. A plus B with the enzyme goes to C. But when you're a systems trained scientist, then you realize that, yes, A and B go to C, but then C is going to interact with D and influence A, which will also influence B, et cetera. And so the whole thing becomes like a loop of, multi-directional influences. So if you went into science because you wanted some kind of absolute certainty, you might lean into being a linear scientist. And that's fine. And, enzymes are good, and stopping cars at red lights so you don't go into a traffic accident is good, but, the fact is there's all sorts of mutual influences that are really hard to fully grasp. And they're certainly really almost impossible to predict. And they're almost impossible to control. You can influence them, but controlling them, that's a different thing. So there's a natural, I think, tendency for human beings who become interested in the world and interested in making inroads into understanding, to lean toward linear science. So the first thing to say is that from a system science point of view, what we generally know about systems is that, when they settle into some kind of homeostasis, when they're in a certain state, for them to change, they often have to go through a period of massive disorganization to reorganize.
Right.
And so the resistance to that disorganization often keeps the status quo going for the system. And let's talk about human beings now. So if we say that, like Robin Wall Kimmerer has, this beautiful book, or initial book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is followed up now by a new book called Service Berries. But she really emphasizes a gift economy, where the whole structure of the way we communicate is not and relate to each other is not about money, but about gifting to other people, where we realize in many ways, as in her group, the Potawatomi Nation, have this way where you have to realize your own particular gifts, develop them, and give them for the well-being of the whole, and I quote her in Intraconnected. And what I would say about the gift economy is it is that kind of shift from, a feeling of scarcity where I need to own my own stuff and keep my stuff away from you because you're going to take my stuff, to rather, here are the berries, here, I give. And that might have us go through a period of disorganization. And what I think we need to do is have some kind of enzymes, if you will. The work you're doing, hopefully words like mui, can be a little bit of enzymes to say, as we go through the period of disorganization, which may be necessary, this moment that seems so dark for many people, so filled with problems, instead of experiencing them as threats, we need to get from the threat mindset of fighting and fleeing and freezing and fainting, out of that threat mindset to a challenge mindset where we say, okay, the system is going to go through a period of disorganization. It's not going to be fun. And we can reorganize into a different way that we communicate, whether it's going to be a gift economy or a MWE notion. The MWE enzyme, if you will, the catalysis, being a catalyst for this experience, is we're going to get the opportunity to actually feel much more whole than the fragmented solo self allows you to feel. And for those of us who are going to try to act as catalysts, I think what we need to do then is have a vision, not for the exact outcome, but a vision for how we go through this period I think we're in right now of massive disorganization, and realize that if the solo self view has been creating this restricted way where we're prone to so much isolation and human created suffering, whether it's with other humans or with the natural world, with the loss of species, we can go through this with catalyzing a movement away from the solo self toward this larger way of living. And so it's the larger meaning, like the MWE. And I think the possibilities are huge. You can almost define hope as accessing possibilities that you didn't know before existed. And so I'm actually very hopeful. I think we need to do what Joanna Macy, the wonderful writer and activist, has always taught, that people need to go through a period of grief. So we need to be honest about, what Albrecht, the environmental philosopher, calls solastalgia, a kind of a longing for the way the world used to be. So we're not just constantly being mad and saying, let's get back and make the world great again or something like that. It's more like, where are we now? How can we live with the grief of how we actually are, and look at what the fundamental causes of the troubles we're in, which I think is this solo self, and then move into this new way. And there's a word called pervasive leadership, is the last thing I'll say to your question, James, which is each individual can be empowered through retreat centers we might form or conversations we might have, where you realize every individual can bring leadership, meaning can bring positive change into the world. And we can give them the kinds of experiences you might do in a retreat or in psychotherapy or in meditation, that allows them to escape that flimsy fantasy of certainty that comes from the master narrative of separation. And I'm very hopeful that we can do this, and I think we have to, I think there's no choice. But the good news is, as a number of writers say, we need to have joy and fun doing this and doing this together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And there's a theorist at Penn State called Richard Doyle who's written about the way that you're coining terms like "mui" and "intraconnected," and he writes about how what he calls word yoga, that words can function as a kind of psychotechnology to produce these changes in consciousness in the way that you're kind of suggesting that there's a real power to coining terms that can help people to access certain ways of looking, certain states of awareness. So I think I really resonate with that. And then the other thing was, I read recently, I can't remember who it was by, but I read something from a contemporary writer that was basically saying that, things can feel dark at this time, but perhaps this isn't a darkness of death, but maybe it's the darkness of the birth canal. And that there's, we're going through some, as you mentioned, the dissolution in order to come out into some more beautiful, transformative birthing into a new world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't think it's just being unrealistically hopeful or optimistic to say just what you're saying, that this moment of turmoil is a moment of opportunity. And
Definitely.
what we need to do is catalyze it in that direction. And we can. And, I do think there's a power in words. And I think there's also a power in this vision that who we are is much more than the individual, and what consciousness is much more than some brain function, right? That awareness allows you to say, hey, I'm aware of the lie of the separate self. That's part of awareness. And I can use consciousness to catalyze change, right? And that's the power of it. So it's a thrill to talk to you about this, James. And I hope this will be the beginning of many more conversations we'll have.
Yeah, I hope so. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Would you send anyone in the audience to anywhere particular online if they want to look into your work more, your books?
Sure. Well, you can do the Wheel of Awareness from my website and get resources there. It's drdansiegel.com. So DR and then DANSIEGEL.com. And then we have extensive courses for anyone who wants to dive really deeply into stuff at the Mindsight, MINDSIGHT, mindsightinstitute.com.
That's great. And thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you. A pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.